It began quietly, without warning, no press leak, no rumor, no diplomatic whisper, just a single order from the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, clear, uncompromising, and timed to the hour. The directive gave the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States 48 hours to vacate Burkina Faso. Not just the agents, not just the equipment, the entire network. That decision, signed by President Ibrahim Traore, would shake Washington to its core and send shockwaves across every intelligence desk in the Western world. For decades, American and European forces had operated freely in the Sahel, monitoring, advising, assisting, or so they said. But in that moment, a young African leader rewrote the rules. What many saw as a diplomatic rupture, Traoré described as something else entirely, a declaration of independence in its truest form. It wasn't about hostility, it was about sovereignty. Burkina Faso will no longer be a playground for foreign powers, his spokesperson said the next morning. We will stand, even if we stand alone. Inside the U.S. Embassy, the atmosphere was electric with disbelief. For years, the presence of the CIA base had been treated as routine, a joint counterterrorism facility. The notion that a small landlocked nation could issue such an ultimatum seemed unthinkable. Yet, it was real, and the countdown had already begun. Across Ouagadougou, news spread faster than the wind. Some celebrated openly, waving flags and chanting in the streets. Others watched with cautious hope. Farmers, students, market traders, people who had grown up under the shadow of foreign presence now felt something shift. It wasn't just politics, it was psychological liberation. For the Burkinabe, it was more than an order. It was a statement that their nation's destiny would no longer be dictated from elsewhere. Behind the scenes, satellite networks went silent. Data servers linked to foreign agencies were sealed. Communications once routed through American channels were re-encrypted under Burkinabe control. It was a digital exorcism, a quiet reclaiming of sovereignty in the age of information. Internationally, the reaction was immediate. Western analysts described Traoré's move as reckless. Others called it historic. France remained silent, though insiders admitted Paris was alarmed. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to assess what they called a new African axis of resistance. Mali and Niger, both already charting independent courses after cutting military ties with France, expressed open solidarity. Their joint communiqué declared, "No nation is truly free if its intelligence is in foreign hands." Within days, rumors circulated of new regional defense protocols, African nations talking directly to each other, building what they called the Alliance of Sovereign States. The West, meanwhile, began to calculate. Without a base in Burkina Faso, the U.S. lost access to a critical surveillance corridor stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. Drones, data streams, and human intelligence were suddenly blind in the heart of the Sahel. But inside Burkina Faso, something deeper was unfolding, a sense of renewal. For years, people had whispered about who truly ran their country. Decisions made in shadowed offices thousands of kilometers away, dictating aid, policy, even leadership choices. The CIA presence had come to symbolize that hidden influence. When Traoré ordered them out, it wasn't just a security decision, it was a moral one. He didn't just close a base, one political analyst said. He opened a new chapter in Africa's story. At the presidential compound, Traoré's advisors worked around the clock. The withdrawal had to be controlled, orderly, irreversible. Reports confirmed that by the end of the 48-hour deadline, the American flag was lowered quietly in the night, equipment was dismantled, files and drives were flown out. The next morning, local engineers entered the compound to begin the transition, converting it into a national intelligence training center. In the heart of Ouagadougou, people gathered in spontaneous celebration. Church bells rang. Mosque loudspeakers echoed prayers of gratitude. The youth painted murals of Sankara and Traoré side by side, symbols of continuity between generations of defiance. But outside Africa, the move triggered fear. Western officials worried that Burkina Faso was drifting into a new orbit, one that could tilt global alliances. Analysts speculated about increased Russian or Chinese involvement, though no evidence confirmed it. What was certain was that the old model of control military bases, intelligence sharing, soft power aid was beginning to crumble. For Africa's young generation, however, this moment meant something else entirely. It was proof that leadership could be bold again, that sovereignty was not a slogan. That power didn't have to mean permission. Traoré himself remained silent for 3 days after the expulsion. Then, in a calm, deliberate broadcast, he addressed the nation. "There comes a time," he said, "when a people must choose between comfort and dignity. We have chosen dignity." His words were measured, almost tranquil, but their impact was seismic. International media replayed the clip endlessly. In European studios, commentators debated whether Burkina Faso had crossed a line. African commentators asked a different question: why did it take so long? As the weeks passed, the young president became a symbol far beyond his borders. In Mali, protesters carried his portrait during demonstrations, demanding the removal of remaining French troops. In Chad and Senegal, student groups chanted his name during rallies about educational reform. Across the continent, the phrase Traoré's 48 hours entered the political vocabulary shorthand for decisive sovereignty. Behind the scenes, new partnerships quietly emerged. Burkina Faso began negotiating technology-sharing agreements with neighboring states to create a Sahelian satellite network, an African alternative to Western data systems. Universities introduced programs on cybersecurity, African geopolitics, and strategic communication. It wasn't just defense that was being rebuilt, it was identity. For decades, African nations had been told that independence was achieved once the flag was raised and the anthem played. But real independence, as this movement showed, meant control over one's information, borders, and resources. It meant saying no, even when saying no came at a cost. And the cost was real. Some aid programs were suspended. Certain Western investors withdrew. The national currency fluctuated. Yet, in the streets, the mood remained resilient. "Better a hard road we walk ourselves than an easy path built by others," a Burkinabe teacher said during an interview. This was not just politics, it was philosophy made visible. For years, Africa had been described as a continent of crisis, dependency, and instability. But the new generation of leadership, young, pragmatic, and fearless, was changing that narrative. They no longer spoke the language of victimhood, they spoke the language of destiny. At the heart of this new voice stood Ibrahim Traore, often photographed in his simple military uniform, unguarded, without extravagance. He represented not a personality cult, but an idea that African nations could choose principle over convenience. In Western capitals, his rise sparked discomfort. Diplomats spoke of populist danger, analysts warned of anti-Western sentiment. But in African capitals, it was seen differently, a rebirth of dignity. When asked later why he acted so suddenly, Traoré reportedly replied, "Sovereignty delayed is sovereignty denied." Those words, repeated across social media, captured the essence of his leadership. He wasn't waiting for perfect timing, international approval, or gradual negotiation. He was acting on conviction. And conviction is contagious. In the months that followed, other African governments began reevaluating foreign military agreements. Some reduced the scope of foreign operations. Others demanded greater transparency. A quiet domino effect was underway. In villages across Burkina Faso, people began referring to that decisive week simply as the liberation of the air. For the first time in memory, they believed that what happened in their country was decided by their own government, not filtered through external channels. Even critics who questioned the risks acknowledged the significance. He might be young, one Western diplomat admitted off record, but he has changed the conversation in Africa forever. The story of those 48 hours became more than a headline, it became a historical marker. Future generations would look back on it as the moment when a small nation dared to tell the world, enough. It wasn't the end of dependence overnight, but it was the beginning of awareness, and awareness is the seed of freedom. Weeks later, in an interview with an African broadcaster, Traoré spoke softly about what it all meant. "Independence is not a flag, it is a discipline," he said. "Every day we must defend it in our economy, in our schools, in our hearts." That statement captured the transformation of a nation. Burkina Faso had moved beyond symbolism into substance. Its revolution was not about arms, but about attitude. Analysts began calling this moment the psychological decolonization of Africa. And they weren't wrong. For a long time, the continent had been rich in resources, but poor in confidence. That imbalance was now being corrected, one decision at a time. The expulsion of the CIA wasn't simply about who occupied a base, it was about who owned the narrative. When the 48th hour finally arrived, no explosions, no chaos, no violence broke out. Just silence. A silence that spoke louder than any weapon. Because that silence meant the message had been received, the era of invisible control was over. From that silence rose a new kind of sound, the hum of reconstruction. New communication towers built by local engineers, young coders in Ouagadougou designing security software, universities rewriting textbooks to teach African political thought through African voices. In a continent long defined by what others did to it, this was a story about what it could do for itself. And at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traore, not as a demagogue, not as a soldier seeking glory, but as a symbol of a generational awakening. His decision had not only redrawn political lines, it had redrawn the boundaries of what African leadership could dare to imagine. From Washington to Paris, analysts continued to argue about what it meant for the West. But for Africa, the answer was already clear. It meant possibility. It meant pride. It meant the return of agency. History may record it as a confrontation, but to millions, it was something more intimate, a reclaiming of voice. And perhaps that's what made it so powerful. Because long after the flags were lowered and the files packed away, the real transformation remained not in the corridors of power, but in the minds of a people who now believed, for the first time in generations, that freedom was not a gift, it was a choice.